This is Asian Insider, and I'm Nirmal Ghosh. Now, about 18 months into their bruising trade war, President Donald Trump and China's Vice Premier Liu He have signed what is commonly called a Phase 1 agreement. Phase 2 is supposed to follow somewhere down the road, and we'll be talking about that soon. But let me first run through the bare bones of this Phase 1 agreement. I'm going to read from some notes here. So the document's formal title is Economic and Trade Agreement between the United States and the People's Republic of China. It has 8 chapters covering intellectual property, technology transfer, trade in food and agriculture products, financial services, macroeconomic policies and currency, expanding trade, and importantly, dispute resolution. As part of the deal, China has also agreed to increase its purchases of U.S. goods and services by at least $200 billion over the next 2 years compared to 2017. And the U.S. will trim some tariffs, but maintain them on $360 billion worth of Chinese imports, which is the bulk of the bilateral trade. And there is a range of commitments by both sides that will only be as strong, as we know, as the degree to which they are implemented and adhered to. So today, joining us to discuss this Phase 1 agreement and its implications are Curtis Chin from Bangkok and Vikram Khanna from Singapore. Curtis is a former US ambassador to the Asian Development Bank and an Asia Fellow at the Milken Institute. Vikram is an associate editor at the Straits Times. Good morning to both of you.
Good morning.
So Curtis, perhaps I should start with you. Does this show that tariffs work? I mean, there is a lot in this agreement. China has conceded a lot, although we know that the tougher issues are supposed to be in a Phase 2 agreement, and we don't know when that's going to be. But so far, do you think tariffs have worked?
Absolutely, Nirmal. For good and for bad, the signing of this trade deal, this Phase 1 trade deals, shows that indeed President Trump's approach of putting in tariffs has worked in many ways. I'm no fan of tariffs. I've been a longtime advocate for free trade and fair trade, but we're at this situation today because of 3 decades, let's say, of engagement with China, which has led to a relationship that does need to be readjusted, to be rebalanced. And through President Trump's implementing of something that many people were not quite fans of, myself included, of tariffs, we have at least made this initial step forward. I have to say, give President Trump due credit for where we are. I think in reality, it's a pause. It's an initial resetting of this relationship. It's a clear political win for President Trump. But there's so much more that needs to be done. It's not just implementation of this Phase 1 deal, but addressing some of the much more difficult challenges that China has posed to many U.S. administrations and many countries around the world, including here in Southeast Asia. But to sum it up, indeed, tariffs have worked so far, but let's see where it leads to next.
Vikram, from your view out there, Singapore's view, what are the regional implications of this? Over here in the US, the market was quite high, and it dipped a bit afterwards when the market realized that there were some caveats and some unanswered questions still, and we have to watch the implementation and so forth. What was the reaction in Southeast Asia, and what are the implications? How is this seen?
Well, I think as Curtis put it, this is a step in the right direction, and the Singaporean Business Federation Chief Ho Meng Kit has said pretty much the same thing. But it's very far from a comprehensive deal, as you mentioned. I think there's a long way to go. I think the fragmentation of supply chains out of China will continue, because I think the really big issues still have to be addressed. And I think there is an awareness that this is a truce, this is a pressing the pause button, but it's also a quite fragile truce for many reasons. You mentioned $200 billion worth of extra purchases forthcoming from China compared to 2017. I think there are doubts about whether China can make good on those purchases, given that its economy is slowing. There are also issues about relating to the WTO. This is basically what's going on is managed trade. You are setting quotas for purchases from the US. So you have to go and tell Brazil and Argentina, sorry, we've been buying soybeans from you, but now we're going to stop and we're going to buy them from the US. Now that is illegal under the WTO. And I think there are a lot of these kind of doubts, what are these countries going to do? Are they going to just lie back and just say accept it? No, they might challenge it on the WTO. And China China is also reluctant to sort of do something that violates WTO commitments. So I think there are a lot of question marks around this deal. And then you mentioned implementation. Implementation, is subject to judgments. China has promised to address certain issues. Address means what? Are they going to eliminate restrictions on equity for the financial sector? Or are they just how are they going to manage this? And the final call that's going to be made on whether China has complied or not is with the U.S., is with Mr. Lighthizer, the U.S. Trade Representative. So you have a situation where the party to the dispute is also the judge. So it's a very strange agreement. It is a step in the right direction, but I think there are questions about its longevity.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the farms, because one interesting thing, I spoke to the CEO of the Iowa Soybean Association the other day, and I was looking at the other responses from the farm sector, and they are all sort of holding their horses at the moment. No one's rushing to buy bigger tractors, as President Trump had advised them to do, because they are waiting to see what comes out of China, especially given the fact, apparently, that all this is going to be decided at market prices. So the U.S. product still has to compete, as you said, with others, like Argentina and Brazil, in the case of soybeans. So, Curtis, would you like to come in on this, on the implications of this for the region and globally?
Absolutely. But I also was struck by the comment that perhaps China is reluctant to do things that will be seen as a counter to its WTO, World Trade Organization obligations. I think the reality that's why we're here is that China has not really done what it had already committed to with the World Trade Organization. When you think about things like forced technology transfers, protection of intellectual property rights. I've been in and out of China when was I was based in Beijing from 95 onwards, and been out of China. And the moment you show up in Beijing, you see how China has, some would say, gamed the system. From when you can't access your Gmail, you can't do so many things. And we talk about an unfair and unlevel playing field where we stand today. Also, there's so much focus. This goes to your question, Nirmal, about the region. So many of these issues that at least begun to be addressed in this Phase 1 trade agreement, things like forced technology transfers, protection of intellectual property rights. These are issues that aren't issues that the U.S. alone has with China. I'm based now in Singapore and travel throughout this region. When I meet with Southeast Asian CEOs, in many ways, and this probably is a big surprise to listeners and viewers back in America, but in many ways, I have people that say to me they're rooting on President Trump, because some of these same things that President Trump is seeking to address, other countries here in Asia also want to address, but they're much smaller than the United States. And as we've seen on very difficult, very terrible issues with which China has been involved in, from Xinjiang to elsewhere, China has been shown to be a vindictive nation. They will seek to punish companies and punish countries. And so smaller countries don't want to be in that position where China will punish them. They're saying to me, well, you, President Trump, and hopefully we will benefit. But again, kudos to both sides, both the Chinese and the United States, for bringing it at least as they then really begin to work on phase two.
Right. No, I think it's quite remarkable that they actually got to this stage and signed something, given the heated rhetoric that we've been seeing and the sort of impasse that they've been at for quite a long time now. So, what about phase two? The key difference between the US and China is, of course, the two completely different systems. Now, phase two, getting successfully to phase two, would require a deep change in China's a structural change, as we've talked about before. How difficult is that going to be? Vikram, could you comment on that?
Yes, these are the really big issues that are still left outstanding. They are the issues of subsidies, for example, and the whole SOE reform, the issues of cyber security, I think the subsidies issue is probably the biggest of all. I mean, this is at the heart of China's economic system. And I think just to pick up on what Curtis said, this is an issue that bothers not just the United States, but also Europe, also Japan, also many countries in Asia. And I think this is why it is important that this huge issue be dealt with as multilaterally as possible. Through the WTO. I think Japan, the EU, and the US have already taken first steps to take this issue to the WTO. So I think it has to be dealt with at the WTO level. It cannot be dealt with only bilaterally. And I think one interesting thing is that although because of this tech war that's going on, because of the restrictions being slapped on Huawei and so on, China has become determined to become even more self-sufficient in as much as possible, as much technology as possible. So that's leading to an increase in subsidies. So ironically, I mean, while there's pressure for it to sort of roll back subsidies, there's also pressure coming from somewhere else on it to increase subsidies. So this is a very tricky issue that has to be dealt with, and I think it has to be dealt with multilaterally.
Interesting also that I'm glad you brought up the tech, because Secretary of State Mike Pompeo gave a very strong speech in San Francisco just the other day, talking about, well, essentially saying that no more US tech for China. They're scrutinizing Chinese investment, Chinese acquisitions, and so forth. And the companies will be basically told not to allow their tech to be taken by joint venture partners and investors from China. So this, despite the smiles and the sort of, all the bonhomie of this big event in DC, the signing of the Phase 1 deal, and it was a big event, it's politically huge for President Donald Trump. Despite all this, the general relationship, again, also with the caveat that they have, President Trump apparently has a nice relationship with President Xi Jinping. The relationship in general remains sour and is showing no real signs of a thaw. There's a lot of pushback from the States still against China, right? Curtis, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, absolutely. Trade, economics, clearly very critical in a relationship between, these two great countries, these two largest economies in the world, China and the United States. But it isn't the only issue that both countries need to address. As you think about the diplomatic engagement beyond the financial and economic, there's still much more that needs to be done. As you know, I'm always the optimist. I'm hopeful. At least we're here at this stage. It's that pause. It's that initial step. Business and markets, whether it's Singapore or back in New York Stock Exchange, they will welcome some sense of stability. That the phase 2 process that you talked about, yes, they're going to begin to talk. The Phase 1 agreement talks about putting in place a process by which the sides will engage. That's a step forward. But there will not be any Phase 2 deal before the elections. And in a way, we talk about the political benefits to President Trump. But there are also political benefits to Xi Jinping. China is also having a very difficult time in its own growth trajectory, still growing slowly, but a slowing economy. Again, anecdotal reports from media when allowed to report of unrest, uncertainty in China, particularly at some of these actually state-subsidized enterprises, which are not the drivers of any economy, including China. China has done so much to lift people out of poverty, for my own work and the days at the Asian World Bank. You think of all that China has done. But in many ways, it's because it's freed up the private sector. But unfortunately, for me as an outsider, they're doubling down on the exact opposite. They're doubling down subsidized state-owned enterprises. They're driving lending, not to the dynamic entrepreneurs that China has so many of. They're driving lending to businesses that really, if markets were allowed to take their course, would have to readjust and become more efficient. Yes, they can subsidize in their competition with other countries, companies around the world, but there's no protecting them from that ultimate day when they too will fail, or they will no longer be able to compete. One thing I did want to flag, which I thought, from a Chinese protocol perspective, I would always argue is very interesting, is that this deal, you think about what happened in Washington, it's President Trump and a Vice Premier, Liu He. The reality is been Xi Jinping and President Trump. And some say it's because, in a bit, this has been a face-saving deal for both sides. We've got to this stage. But very intriguing that it was not Xi Jinping. And those of you who follow Chinese history, will Liu He be thrown under the bus at some point if it doesn't work out as how China hopes it will, or as both sides hope it will work out? Because in some ways, maybe Xi Jinping is a little bit removed from this deal. Clearly, it wouldn't have happened without him. But to the degree that this was not his unique special envoy representing Xi Jinping, to me says something too. That Xi Jinping is a very difficult challenge, both internally as well as clearly with the United States. But you think about what has happened in this last really 6 or 7 months, from protest in Hong Kong to a landslide re-election by the Taiwanese president. This is a statement about what is going on in Beijing and how Beijing has approached. So how will this evolve and how will this change? And clearly, if you're a Chinese person, maybe just like an American person who just wants a better life for their families, for their communities, that slow Chinese economy will be something that they will ultimately have to hold their leadership accountable for. Unlike democracies in Singapore, United States, you don't like your government, you vote them out.
Vikram, I'd like to bring you in for just give you the last word, just 20 seconds. So, do you feel more sanguine now about phase one deal? Do you think markets and economies in the region will see, a little bit of a return?
Well, I would give it a slightly more cautious welcome. I mean, I think, as I mentioned, I think it is quite fragile. I think it's not clear, at least from China's point of view, it's not clear what they need to really do to get under the sort of 360 billion or 250 billion, 25% tariffs that remain in place. There's no schedule for tariff rollback. There's nothing to say that, okay, if you do this, we'll roll back by this much. If you do this, we'll roll back by this much. It's all up in the air. I think this is a deal that both sides can walk away from quite easily. China can decide that the US is not responding by reducing tariffs fast enough, so we're going to stop buying American soybeans. America can say China is not living up to its commitments, so we're going to snap back on the tariffs. So I think this deal is subject to a lot of uncertainty. I mean, it's welcome. It's always good to have a deal. A deal is better than no deal, and this is not a comprehensive deal. So I would give it only a very cautious welcome.
Okay, great. Vikram, thank you very much. Curtis, thank you very much. That was great. Thanks a lot for your time, and have a great day out there.
Thanks, Nirmal. Bye-bye.
So, lots of big numbers in the phase one deal with China, and President Trump also is going to get his US-Mexico-Canada agreement, the USMCA, passed by the Senate and signed into law. So he will have plenty to talk about at his rallies, and it will go down very well with his support base as the campaign gears up. For Asian Insider, I'm Nirmal Ghosh.